Hello and welcome to this episode of Lasting Transformation with me, Alun Parry, the author of How to Remove Trauma Response, a Memory Reconsolidation guidebook for therapists and coaches. Now, in this episode of the podcast, I want to look at the importance of discovery work. A lot of people, when we're looking at transformation and memory reconsolidation approaches, naturally get really focused on the memory reconsolidation part, the bit where the brain actually updates the old emotional learning. And it's understandable because that's the juicy part, that's the exciting part, that's the bit that creates change. But in order to give the brain what it needs in order to be able to do that, you need to be able to activate the right emotional learning. You have to target the right thing in order to mismatch it. Because if you target the wrong thing, then you're going to be creating reconsolidation around something that actually is not relevant to the problem at all. And so the problem will stay in place. So what I'm going to look at today is one of the common mistakes that people make, even when they know about memory reconsolidation. And that is about basically staying too much on the surface when it's necessary to go a level deeper. So whenever a client presents with something like anxiety or panic or some kind of a stuck pattern, the natural instinct is just to work with what's visible. Okay, so they're anxious, let's just try and mismatch the anxiety. So the thing that they say sets it off. Oh, I see. So they're anxious in that situation. So let's just mismatch that. But one of the most important distinctions when doing this work is the discovery aspect. So you actually know whether the thing in front of you is the actual trigger or whether it's just the surface level of some deeper emotional truth. And that deeper emotional truth is the thing that needs to be dealt with. And it's important, obviously, because if you get that wrong, it doesn't just slow the work down. It actually means that you're mismatching the wrong thing entirely. So this episode is all about developing that sense of getting better with discovery work so you know whether you're working with the right thing. So there's a few things I'm going to talk about today, 3 in particular. The first one is, I want to look at that surface trigger and look at those moments when the trigger is exactly what it looks like. Secondly, though, I want to go into what I think is more commonly the case, is where the surface trigger is not what it looks like, but there is actually something going on deeper. And then the third thing I want to look at is exactly why that really is important if what you want to achieve is consistent client transformation. So let's look at that first thing, the surface trigger. And excuse my voice as well. If it sounds a little bit funny, I've had a really bad head cold the last 10 days, so I'm a little bit croaky. But the first thing is the surface trigger. Like, when is the surface trigger exactly what it looks like? So some responses are really straightforward and very clean. You know, they're very connected to the thing that triggers them. And a good example of this, for instance, is, let's say the nervous system at some point in a person's life encounters something overwhelming, unsafe, something that triggered an emotional memory, and they learned that it was dangerous. It would make sense then for them to now respond every time that thing appears. So a really clear example that I often use is, let's say someone was involved in some form of road traffic accident. In the aftermath of that, whenever they sit behind the wheel of their car, they feel uneasy, they feel panicked even. And so they end up seeking help from yourself as a practitioner. Now, in this case, the chain of cause and effect is just right there in front of you. They had a road traffic accident. Now when they sit behind the wheel of a car, their nervous system responds with a sense of, this is not safe. It remembers that this same thing led. It has that association between the trigger and the response. So it's really, really straightforward. And in those incidents, there doesn't need to be a great deal of digging underneath the surface. It just instantly makes sense why sitting behind the wheel of a car is something that is going to be associated with the road traffic accident. And so that trigger is going to give that response. Now, a lot of people work with memory reconsolidation in this way. And in this, what I'd say is probably a minority of cases, that works really well. And that is going to be really effective, because when it comes to creating mismatch experiences that will then trigger the brain into triggering memory reconsolidation, you're actually activating the right thing. And so the nervous system is doing exactly what it's designed to do there, to protect, and there's almost no discovery work needed. And so in a similar sort of way, let's say something horrendous happened to somebody and the room was a particular shade of blue. Whenever they see that shade of blue again, their nervous system might go, oh, there's that thing. There's that colour where the bad things happened. And so it makes sense that it would trigger a sense of unsafety. And so when we're looking at these very clear, there's a trigger, there's a response, it matches up, it makes sense. The target then is really, really clear. The emotional learning is really straightforward. And so it doesn't matter in those cases that you're not going into deeper discovery, because deeper discovery to find out what's really driving the problem isn't really necessary. It's right there under your nose. And so you can get on then with creating mismatch experiences and using those kind of techniques, which are really very surface level and work really well with a trigger and response. And so in those moments, you don't need to distrust that. You don't need to go looking for meaning that isn't there. The problem with this, though, is this is the minority of cases, and especially if you're working with those things that have a deeper emotional learning, and you tend to work, say, with things that happen in people's childhoods and so on, which is commonly what we do. This isn't really going to cut it. I'm going to give you an example of that as we look at the second point in this podcast, because the second point that I want to get across is the vast majority of times, I would say, depending on your client base, is that surface trigger, in the majority of cases, that's not what the emotional learning is. So let's say someone has panic around giving a talk. On the surface, it looks really similar. There's a particular event, there's anxiety, there's avoidance. And so it looks the same. It looks like, okay, this is just like the road traffic accident. This is just like that thing is providing this trigger. Now, that might be the case. Maybe someone is inherently scared about going and giving a talk. It might be that the very idea of all those eyes upon them is the exact thing that's causing the difficulty. I'd still argue there's a bit more digging to do, mind you, to find out exactly what that emotional prediction is. But still, it feels quite similar in that case. But this is what is often missed when we just work with the surface. Because just because someone is feeling anxious or panicked around the very idea of giving a talk doesn't mean that it's the talk itself necessarily that they're concerned about. So, let's say in this particular case, someone's given a talk, and in actual fact, they're not inherently scared of giving presentations. Maybe they've given presentations in the past and it's been fine, but this talk is different. And the reason for this talk being different is they actually think they've got something really powerful to say. And they think that once they've finished the event, once they've actually given the talk, it's really going to rocket them in terms of their career. And so the real anxiety when we do the discovery work and find out what it is that's going on that is actually creating the anxiety is not that they're scared of the talk, but that their system is, if in a sense, deploying anxiety in order to try and get them to stop and not do the talk at all. And the reason why it wants them not to do the talk at all isn't because it's scared of talks. It's because their system knows that this is going to be so successful, and the end result is that they would outperform their dad. And their emotional learning is, I'm not allowed to outperform dad. So you see, in that case, it's no good to stay on the surface. It's fine with the road traffic accident. It's fine to create mismatches around being in the car. But it doesn't make sense to create mismatches around giving a talk, because giving a talk was never really the issue. It looked like that on the surface. But the thing that one would have to mismatch in this particular case is the emotional learning of I'm not allowed to outperform dad. If you do stuff around mismatching the talk itself, the belief of I'm not allowed to perform dad will still be there and the anxiety will remain. And it's a really, really good example of why, for the most part, we don't want to mismatch the anxiety, but we want to find out why the anxiety is essential, why some part of our client's system believes that it's absolutely essential to create anxiety in the client in order to perform some function. What is the reason behind that? Now, in this case, this example case that we're talking about, the nervous system has learned I'm not allowed to outperform dad. The nervous system realizes this is one hell of a powerful talk. And so it's producing the anxiety to try and ensure that they don't perform dad. Because if they give that talk, they're pretty sure that success is at the other side of it. So here, what we need to do is to find out and make sure that we do the digging and the discovery work to try and understand what the system's worldview is that is creating the anxiety. That the anxiety is essential, why? And when we get to the answer, well, I'm not allowed to outperform dad, that is the thing that needs to be mismatched, not the anxiety itself. So you can see a real distinction here between the road traffic accident and getting behind the wheel of a car and the anxiety coming. There, it might well make sense to mismatch those anxious feelings on the surface. But here with this talk, where there is some deeper learning, which is the vast majority of cases, you need to be able to find out why the anxiety is being produced rather than just mismatch that uncomfortable feeling. What needs to be mismatched here is the core emotional truth that makes the anxious response essential. Because once they get to a point where they feel safe and that it's okay, and they no longer believe that they're not permitted to outperform dad, the anxiety of giving this talk would naturally fall away. And so in this case, the talk isn't the trigger. The talk is something, the trigger is something different. The part of themselves that is noticing the underlying danger based on that core prediction is intervening. And it's that core underlying emotional learning, that worldview, that rule, that identity level belief that we need to get to and mismatch and update if we're going to have any way of transforming that problem. So in this case, the surface trigger is not the thing to mismatch. The surface trigger is just the doorway, the portal that allows us to explore what's really going on underneath that. And by using our discovery techniques, we can find out what that underlying trigger is. So we've seen already then that sometimes the surface can be the trigger, but mostly it tends to be some emotional learning that's beneath that. that the presenting thing is not the thing that we mismatch, but the presenting thing is just the strategy of the client's nervous system, if you like, what I sometimes think of as the invisible twin that wants to keep reproducing the problem. And we just need to find out why. And that typically is the thing that needs to be mismatched. And so in the third point, I'm going to bring that together in order to make it clear why that's so important. If what you're wanting to do is to get consistent transformational change for your clients. Now, the reason why it's so important is what the brain needs in order to trigger memory reconsolidation. And of course, memory reconsolidation is the only known brain mechanism that is capable of functionally erasing emotional learnings. What the brain needs is an activation of the core prediction that is keeping the problem alive. And then what it needs is some sort of mismatch experience that effectively disconfirms that, effectively bumps up against it, and the two things can't be true at the same time. So it becomes really important then to do the discovery well so that we're activating the right thing. We're actually activating the thing that's keeping the problem alive. Now, in the first instance with the road traffic accident, it's a straightforward trigger response. You sit in the car, you get the response, no problem. That can then be the right thing to activate that feeling of being in the car. But when we looked at the second case, to activate the feeling of giving a talk and all those people looking at you and all of those kind of things wouldn't actually be activating the right thing at all. And so in that second case, which I think is the majority, if you're activating the surface thing, like in the road traffic accident, what you'll actually be doing is failing to achieve memory reconsolidation. Because the thing that needs to be activated is not the anxiety, is not the presenting system, but the reason why the presenting system is considered so necessary by the system. In this case, I can't outperform dad. I'm not allowed to outperform dad. So the thing that we need to be activating has to be the right thing, has to be the thing that is actually driving the problem. Because it's only when that's activated that we can mismatch the right thing. It's like having a lock and a key. If you put that key into the wrong lock, it just isn't going to work. So the activation is like the lock. We need to ensure that we're using the lock that is relevant to the problem, the thing that keeps on reproducing the problem. And that's why discovery work is so important, because unless you're mismatching the correct thing, then you're mismatching something that is not even relevant. And so even if you were to reconsolidate that belief, it wouldn't actually get you anywhere, because that belief is not the thing that's driving and recreating the problem at all. It's not the thing that's keeping that problem alive. And so it's only when you do the discovery work and do that well that you have any chance of being able to consistently deliver the transformation that happens when you trigger memory reconsolidation. Memory reconsolidation absolutely requires you to activate the relevant issue, the relevant emotional learning that keeps the problem alive in order to mismatch it. And your key to be able to do that is to get your discovery work correct. And that's why I think this is so important. And that's why I think it's such a big mistake amongst even practitioners who know about memory reconsolidation, because so many that I've seen have a temptation to just mismatch the surface level presentation. And while there are some cases of that where that's perfectly fine, like the road traffic accident or like the particular color of blue, for the vast majority of things, the presenting problem is merely a strategy that the client's own system is using for some really essential reason. In this case, I'm not allowed to outperform dad. And so it's only when that is mismatched that we can get change. There are always 3 levels to memory reconsolidation work. We want to know what the problem is. We want to know the discovery in terms of why is that problem essential? Why is the system maintaining that problem and keeping it alive, even though the client doesn't actually want it? And then thirdly, we get to the reconsolidation bit, the juicy bit. But that middle part, the discovery, is all important because that is the very thing that we have to mismatch. So I'm going to draw it to a conclusion. We've seen already that the surface trigger can be exactly what it looks like. We've seen that in terms of a road traffic accident, for instance. We've seen that in terms of certain cues in the environment that remind somebody of an awful event. And then you just got a straightforward trigger response. But my argument is that's probably the minority of cases. But in the majority of the sort of psychological blocks and trauma responses and other things that are getting in the way of our life, they're actually driven by deeper emotional learnings. And a big, big part of our job as memory reconsolidation practitioners, as transformational practitioners, is to really understand the worldview of the client's own autonomic nervous system. So we understand the core emotional learning that is keeping the problem alive. That we actually think of the problem as it shows up as merely a defensive strategy, an aversive strategy that is trying to push the client away from the thing that would be catastrophic. In this case, the thing that is catastrophic, according to the client's system, or a part of the client's system at least, is that it would be a bad thing, an unsafe thing, a disconnecting thing maybe, if you were to outperform dad. And so what the discovery work allows us to do there is to get to the real reason why the problem is being maintained. And then the third thing we saw, of course, is that that's absolutely crucial because the brain relies on mismatch experiences. But there's no use triggering memory reconsolidation on a core belief or some sort of nervous system response that is not even relevant to the problem. And the only way we can find out what's relevant to the problem and what's driving it is by doing our discovery work well. When we do our discovery work well, we have the right thing to mismatch. And when we mismatch the right thing, transformation happens. So I hope that's useful. And I hope you can see that inconsistency in results often isn't just about technique. It's actually more about doing the work in such a way that you're able to get the right target, the right core emotional learning, the right thing to activate so you can mismatch. And that then puts you in a place where you're updating the right emotional learning, and then your results stop being lucky, stop being hit and miss, and become reliable and consistent. And this kind of distinction doesn't come from a protocol or anything like that. It simply comes from understanding the brain mechanism of memory reconsolidation, understanding what it is the brain needs in order to change everything in terms of your client's life. Now, if you want to go deeper on this, and if you want to really master the kind of discovery work that I'm talking about in this episode that is so crucial, then this is exactly the kind of clinical thinking that we develop inside the Memory Reconsolidation Elite Coaching Academy. When you join the Coaching Academy, you'll get the framework behind the tools, so you'll always know which one to reach for. And in terms of this particular episode, you will very quickly master the art of being able to get to the true emotional learning that is genuinely keeping your clients' problems alive so that you can then mismatch and update them. So if that's something that you're interested in, you could join the Memory Reconsolidation Elite Coaching Academy. You'll find that at freshtherapists.com/coaching. That's fresh therapists, plural, freshtherapists.com/coaching. And if you'd like to work with me directly, one-to-one, whether you're a therapist or not, for pursuing your own personal development and overcoming your own blocks, then you can work with me at alunparry.com. That's ALUN, alunparry.com. So I hope this has been useful. I hope this has sharpened your thinking and how you think about what the real trigger is, to find out what the real emotional learning is that's keeping the problem alive. I hope it's sharpened that, and I hope it's been useful for you. So thanks for listening, and I will see you on the next one.